Well, hello everybody.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
Yeah, and I gave you a handout in the form of the Constitution and Canons of the Episcopal Church, and so you should have that in front of you. If there's any left over, I'll bring it back with me because we're doing a celebration of new ministry down in Ardmore at the beginning of February. If not, I'll just buy a whole supply, but I just thought you really needed to have your own copy of the Constitution and Canons. They're delivered, of course, to a rector, obey these canons and be with us to take your part in the councils of the diocese. But as we'll take a look, these are, in a sense, the Constitution and Canons of the Church are the terms to which you agree in order to be a part of the ordained ministry of the Episcopal Church. And so I think it's very important for you to be able to have them. And certainly there's no requirement that you memorize them or even like them. But there is a certain article of the Constitution that you'll sign on to someday if you're wanting to be ordained, and we'll get into that. So I also have a couple other handouts, and what they do at the diocesan office, which is great fun, is they'll take one and they'll make a copy of it and they'll spiral bind it because we open them so many times that if we simply used a square binding, we would break it. I open this book together with the prayer book and the Bible almost daily because there's always something referring to the Constitution and Canons. So, and if you go through, especially those canons that deal with the formation of people to be ordained, clearly there are three standards that are in there. One is formation. And formation, at least in my mind, happens, from the time you leave the car in the parking lot to the time that you get back in it to go back home again, and on the journey. So gathering at the lunch table to have a meal together is a part of formation. Gathering on Sunday morning upstairs for Eucharist is a part of formation. Informal conversations. So there's and the idea of being formed carries with it at least an implication that you're not formed into that form yet, which is why you need formation. And so formation can also be inherently difficult and counterintuitive. So if part of this isn't hurting a little bit, something's wrong. Rabbi Friedman used to say that the process of self-differentiation is the process of increasing your threshold of pain and lowering your expectations. Nobody gets to play the piano unless they first have to convince themselves that they're not Rachmaninoff from the moment they sit down at the bench. And so lowering the expectations to one's abilities and then being able to live into the discomfort is a part of the formation. A second part is maybe the more obvious part of what we do under the canons, and that is education. So there's formation, there's education. And of course, you spend plenty of time, especially as you're looking at things like the Reformation of the Church and such, church history, theology, all that. And then the third piece is training. Formation and education doesn't cover everything. And training is simply guiding us all to an essential skill that is necessary. And so the training aspects of living into Title III of the Canons of the Church has to do with things like what is the Church's teaching on racism? Now, there's also a training requirement that most people will say that safeguarding training satisfies. I don't think so, but 99% of the people do. If you take Safeguarding God's Children, you have complied with that part of the canon. So there's racism, the prevention of sexual misconduct, and then two other aspects which we'll cover today. One is a general discussion of the Constitution and Canons of the Church, and then we'll take a little break, and then we'll go into Title IV in particular, okay? Which are the disciplinary canons. Any questions, any comments, or before we get into that? Okay. And I understand we have a member of the bar amongst us. I welcome anyone who's got that. And as a matter of fact, all of us should feel free to be able to get into the conversation when we're talking about law, whether that's civil law or ecclesiastical law. So the first thing that fascinates me when I look at this is the Constitution itself. So if you look at your handout that's in front of you, it should say something that sounds like what a constitution is: a body of fundamental principles or established precedents according to which a state or other organization is acknowledged to be governed. The Constitution is not a law in and of itself. It's rather a set of principles to which the laws will perform some kind of a function. And notice in that definition of a constitution, it doesn't say that it has to be written. You know, the Constitution of the English people is an unwritten constitution. And if you go up into Scotland, you'll see that the law practice there derives more from Roman law. And so it doesn't need to be written. In our sense, it is, but it doesn't have to be. What are the principles? You might want to say, what's our mission or purpose, or what are the things that we value? And so that is put in the form of some kind of a constitution. And then the canons themselves, a general law, principle, or criteria by which something is judged. So when you heard in today's reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah, a bruised reed he will not break, right? And so the word canon translates almost exactly from the Greek into the English. C-A-N-O-N, just one N. The other one is something else. And so the idea of a canon being a standard, and it evolves down into the word for reed. Back in my home in Florida, I'm doing a little bit of landscaping, and I had to interrupt that in order to come back to Oklahoma. But I need a piece of lawn that's about that long. And it doesn't have to be 3 feet 4 inches. It doesn't have to be measurable. It needs to be that long. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the garage and I'm going to cut a piece of pipe, PVC pipe, and it'll be that long. And then I'll use that to measure everything else that's going on with the little landscaping project that I'm doing. That idea of a standard, a measuring rod, a stick, a yardstick, whatever, a ruler, is the idea of what a canon is. It's a standard by which something is judged. And please note in that a canon, it's comparative, it's not evaluative. So that idea of a standard or canon then goes into what are the standards of our church, therefore what are the canons of our church. And in the medieval period, when the great cathedrals are being built, there's a desire for greater accuracy. And so the great cathedrals came up with a standard list of clergy, a canonical list of clergy, which is how the clergy attached to the cathedral become canons. And so it doesn't mean that a canon is any better than anybody else. It's not a rung up the hierarchical ladder, right? It's just simply it's a designation that says that this person, this value, whatever it is, measures and compares to the standard that we have put together. Does that make sense? So you have the Constitution being a kind of set of ideals or principles, and then the canons being the thing by which you measure that. So let's take a look at some of these other things here. And I'll say that I gave you a copy of the Episcopal Church's Constitution and Canons. There's another one that you can get online by going to epiok.org, and it's the Constitution and Canons of the Diocese of Oklahoma. Okay, that I figure you can probably get all by yourself. So, and I won't get into much of that. So take a look at page 1 of the handout that's there, and I've gone through some of that. Also, the Constitution canons are available the Episcopal Church are available in Spanish. I don't think, Sarah, they're not available in Spanish for the diocese, right? I've never seen one anyway.
the diocese.
Yeah, not for the diocese, but the Episcopal Church has one. So you can see that according to the archives of our church, the Constitution and Canons is the official set of governing rules. They're typically revised in part by amendments. The last General Convention, forgive me, the 2015 General Convention, I served on a committee called the Resolutions Review Committee. All the resolutions went through that group, and then it went out onto the floor. And part of what happens during the General Convention is the modification or the updating of the canons. So the canons can be modified at any one meeting of the General Convention, but to amend the Constitution of the Episcopal Church requires 2 consecutive sessions of the General Convention. So essentially it takes 6 years to make a change to the Constitution of the Church. The Constitution of the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States of America was read and signed at this 1789. This says 1785 for a reason. This is the first General Convention, but the ratification was 1789, and the first canons at a second convention held at the same year. So let's go to page 2. So we'll focus a little bit on the Constitution of the Episcopal Church. And that's, yep.
I have a question.
Yeah, oh, sure.
You say that we have canons for the Episcopal Church in the United States in a national way, but at the same time we have canons for every diocese.
Each diocese has its own set of...
Is there a big difference between them? Or?
Well, it tends to be just more specific. So if the national canons will say a general statement in the canons, if it needs more adaptability or more specificity, that'll happen. For example, unique in this diocese, and it would be different from every other diocese, is who gets to vote at the diocesan convention. So in the Diocese of Oklahoma, All Souls Episcopal Church has a delegation of 12 people. And in the diocese that I come from, the Diocese of Southwest Florida, there's never more than 2. So something like that would be addressed in the local or the diocesan canons. Yeah, sure thing. Okay, on page 1 of the Blue Book there is the Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution. I just want to make a couple of points about that. One is that the Episcopal Church, in its Constitution and canons, never uses the word denomination to describe itself. You won't find the Episcopal Church describing itself. It's sometimes referred to as a denomination, but the word that we use in the Constitution and canons is the Episcopal Church is a church. And it's a part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So one of the things that I think is useful to hold in mind, especially when we're having interfaith or ecumenical dialogue, is that we already believe that the church is one. There's no mechanics that needs to be arrived at in order to make the church one, because the church is already one holy Catholic and Apostolic in the mind of Christ. So we don't have to do any more work to make one mega Christian church. The church is already one. Another piece I think worth noting, because I underlined it, is these are churches that are in communion with the See of Canterbury. It's theoretically possible that the Archbishop of Canterbury, over his tea and jam at breakfast at Lambeth Palace, could kind of say, Episcopal Church, not so much. And at that point, the Episcopal Church ceases to be a part of the Anglican communion as it is described within the preamble of the Constitution. So our relationship with the See of Canterbury is something that we recognize as being essential. And when it comes to the Anglican Church in North America, the National Anglican Church, the National Catholic Anglican Church, the Catholic Anglican, Anglican Catholic, all those derivative bodies are specifically not in communion with the See of Canterbury. Okay, And the second point making, upholding and propagating the historic faith and order as set forth in the Book of Common Prayer. In my notes saying the Book of Common Prayer is more than a way of doing worship. The Book of Common Prayer is not an option among options, where on your, on your shelf, if you've got the Book of Common Prayer and Enriching Our Worship, the New Zealand Prayer Book, and a few others, that among those books, it is the Book of Common Prayer that sets forth our worship, and as we would say, it sets forth the faith and the order of the book. So I embrace diversity, but the reason that I'm a prayer book fundamentalist is that it's hard to depart from something that you don't know, right? You know, if you depart from something you don't already know, you're merely wandering. And I love what Bishop Tom Breidenthal of the Diocese of Southern Ohio said about this, where we were having this dialogue about the use of the Book of Common Prayer. And of course, in every diocese, there's a group of people who just thinks that the New Zealand Prayer Book is the greatest thing that ever fell out of a tree. And they're beautiful words, wonderful poetry, but Bishop Breidenthal's point being that that book was the result of their work. And it's kind of not fair to say that we shouldn't be getting together to do our work as a part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And so that really hit me hard when I heard about it, that our liturgy, and you heard me say the last time that I was here, what is liturgy? Light or gia, right? The work of the people. And so there is work set before us. I really welcome the whole idea of prayer book revision. It's been 51 years, maybe long enough, right? So and whatever work we do is the work that we do. But it's a shortcut to just take somebody else's book and use it. Because, again, the prayer book sets forth the faith and order of the Church. So if you go to the Constitution, I'm not asking you to do that right now, you'll see it's a relatively short document. The Constitution is only 14 pages long, and it has 12 articles in it. So they're brief, and they're very general. Of the General Convention itself, of bishops consecrated in foreign lands, the Constitution will mention that you need a standing committee. The canons will go forth and tell you how those are constituted. I note that I took special note of the prerequisites of ordination, Article 8 of the Constitution. So when we have an ordination, as we did, what was it, yesterday? Feels like 2 days ago, but it was yesterday with Chris Cole's ordination at Trinity Church in Tulsa. The service kind of stops while he signs a document, and the bishop signs it, and then we come into prayer. That is a declaration that the ordinand makes to believe. Right, so the first declaration is, I do believe the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament be the Word of God, and to contain all things necessary to salvation. And the second is that you solemnly engage to conform to the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Episcopal Church, which is why this particular discussion is so important. How can you agree to conform to something that you've never taken a look at? So the Constitution canons are a part of the discipline of the Church. Make sense? Okay. So any comments about the Constitution itself? Okay. Let's move toward the canons. And I'm on page 3. This may get a little thick from time to time, so forgive me. Unlike the Constitution, which is 14 pages long, the canons go into a lot more detail. The canons of the Episcopal Church are organized in 5 general titles. Title 1, which is rather lengthy, goes into the organization of the Church, describing the office of the presiding bishop and the official name of the Episcopal Church, the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. You might be surprised. You might want to go to page 93 of this book, because it does surprise people, but I think it's something that you ought to know. Title 2, Canon 2, of the translations of the Bible. A lot of people would probably challenge the reading of this. The lessons prescribed in the Book of Common Prayer shall be read from the translation of the Holy Scriptures, commonly known as the King James or Authorized Version. So the King James remains the standard authorized version of the Bible. Now, but it also says, together with the marginal readings authorized by use by the General Convention of 1901, or one of the three translations known as the Revised Versions. And then it goes all the way down. For me, my favorite one to use is the Jerusalem Bible, which is mentioned in here, but it always gives a kind of a deference or a respect in naming the King James Bible as being the authorized version of the Holy Scriptures. And I think you ought to know that. You know, your opinion is your opinion, but again, know what the words say, and you know, if you want to, you can run for election and change these, because it's this Constitution and Canon does not come to us from a curia of ordained people, right? It's lay people, bishops, priests, and deacons gathered together in the General Convention, which is the source of the authority of this, right? So it can be changed. So anyway, that's Title 2 concerning the worship, and notice it's only 6 pages long. It's rather brief. Now, the ministry section, Title 3, is by far not only the longest section of the canons of the Church, but it's the one that you ought to be the most interested in, because it governs the ordination process. Okay? So moving over to Title 3, let me see, where do I begin? One of the things that people think about without always getting into a whole lot of depth about it is Title 3 describes the Commission on Ministry. So the Commission on Ministry is required, and a lot of people think that the Commission on Ministry is set forth for the purpose of governing or regulating the ordination process. Now, it includes that, but that is not the essential or complete function of any Commission on Ministry. In each diocese there shall be one, and then it says, the Commission shall advise and assist the bishop in the implementation of Title 3 of these canons. So everything that's under Title 3 is also under the umbrella of the Commission on Ministry. And so, for example, in the Diocese of Southwest Florida, there's a lot of dialogue as to whether or not deacons should vote at the diocesan convention. It was immediately referred to the Commission on Ministry for study. And a report came forth from the Commission on Ministry. Why? Because that is something that touches on the ministry of the Church, not necessarily ordination, but the ministry of the Church. Therefore, it was most appropriately entrusted to the Commission on Ministry for study. So don't think that the Commission on Ministry is simply there for the purpose of telling you whether or not you're going to be a postulant or a candidate or anything like that. It's a much broader, much wider Title 3, and we'll get into that right now. Any questions? Okay. Oh, we're doing good. All right. Canon 2 of Title 3 requires that one be established. And as I said, Canon 2 empowers the Commission to advise the bishop in all aspects of the ministry of the Church. When you get to what those licensed lay ministries of the Church are, you skip over Canon 3, you go to Title 4. So if in your parish you've got a pastoral leader or a worship or a lay preacher, any of that, that too is covered under Title 3, Canon 4. And I haven't run into anybody yet in the diocese who's a licensed lay preacher or a licensed lay worshiper. Does anybody know whether or not that's ever happened in this diocese?
It has happened in the past many years ago. I don't know if they're still around.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. The Canon 5 talks about general provisions regarding ordination. They're general provisions, so you don't have to get into the weeds about it. But page 104, general provisions regarding ordination is something that's worth reading. It's worth knowing a little bit about. So here in the Diocese of Oklahoma, we use the words transitional deacon. And is the other one a permanent deacon? Vocational deacon, thank you. I have found it over the years to be handy just to say, if you're a deacon, you're either a Canon 6 deacon or a Canon 8 deacon. A Canon 6 deacon is a deacon that moves through the canonical process with the intent that at the end that they will remain a deacon. A Canon 8 deacon is a deacon who goes through the ordination process with the intent that at some point following their ordination as a deacon, they'll be made a priest, therefore what you commonly call a transitional deacon. And I found that easier simply to say Canon 6 and Canon. After a while, people kind of catch on to that and begin to use it, and I think it lends some clarity. So those who are vocational deacons, I forgot to even use that word, forgive me, that's Canon 6. It talks about the importance of writing Ember Day letters, sets forth standards, the Church's teaching on racism, what we're doing here, and then regulations for ordination to the diaconate. So 6 has to do with deacon, deacon, only deacon. And 7 then gets into the life and work of deacons. So once you've been made a deacon, what does the Church expect of you? So the rights, responsibilities, and then everyone is considered in the Episcopal Church who's ordained to be retired once they have attained the age of 72. Now, it doesn't mean you can't work anymore. Immediately, in talking about mandatory retirement, the canon goes on to say that the bishop, at his or her discretion, may appoint a person to serve in various capacities, but from the age of 72 forward, all of those appointments are considered to be annual, which kind of gives us all an opportunity to kind of evaluate how things are going on in the life of a bishop or a priest or a deacon. So 6 and 7 are linked to one another. One is kind of during the ordination process, and the one is after, 7 is after. Very similarly, Canons 8 and 9 then talk about the life and work of priests, starting with Canon 8, which would be those deacons, those who are like Chris yesterday, right, ordained a deacon, but will probably sometime in the middle of the year be ordained a priest, that under Canon 8, it feels a little bit more like a seminary training. Canon 6 insists that training for deacons be local and in community. That is not the same kind of wording here. And then, unlike the deacon, to be ordained a priest in our church, you must have some kind of a cure or an assignment or a call. The bishop cannot simply just ordain you to be a priest kind of at large or for no reason whatsoever. There's got to be some kind of an assignment or a call or a ministry that you're moving toward. Why? Because as a priest, you're joining the councils of the church as an elder, right? A presbyter, an elder of the church. And so the canons insist that there be a call, or it's literally known as an exercise of office. Then it goes on to Canon 9, the life and work of priests, what happens afterward. And then it goes into those priests who are in charge of parishes to spend some time on that, assistants, chaplains, and other non-parochial priests. I think it's good to know that Section 6 of Canon 9 gives specific reference to those priests who are in charge of parishes. Now, in the Diocese of Oklahoma, that could be a bivocational priest or not. But if you're in charge of that parish, whether you're even receiving compensation for that, as long as you're the person who's in charge, then this pertains to you. Doesn't matter if you've been to seminary, Iona, or if they call it read for holy orders. If you're in charge, this is what's expected. And it requires those priests to propagate teaching on stewardship, preparations for baptism, confirmation, preparations for the bishop's visit, the stewardship of the discretionary fund, and if a pastoral letter comes out, the priest who's in charge of the parish has the obligation to read that pastoral letter to the congregation. You can't just put it in the bulletin. And then, of course, the maintenance of the parish register. Yeah?
So are bivocational priests, is that something that's recognized in the canons as a title?
I would call that an Oklahoma, Texas, North and South Dakota, Wyoming thing.
So it's probably
that,
their canons.
Yeah, it would be, with the way I see it myself is that bivocational ministry is an intent of the bishop in consort with the Commission on Ministry and Standing Committee to put a discipline upon the priesthood that, and there's 5 of them. I can't always remember all 5, so forgive me. One is that you're not deriving a living from this. The other is that you will not transfer your canonical residence to another diocese, to another jurisdiction. There's a third one that you won't, that you work in underserved areas, particularly in rural congregations that would not otherwise have the services of a priest. So and I consider that to be a discipline. It's interesting to note that even in Rome, celibacy is not an essential quality of priesthood. It's a discipline that's placed upon it. So the bishop, and the question would remain, I mean, if you want to get into the Supreme Court level, of which we don't have one, would be whether or not that is a that is a discipline that's supported in the Blue Book, you know. So anyway, but I also recognize that bivocational ministry. I like the way they talk about it down at Camp Allen, with thriving in bivocational ministry. That this is something of essential need. In the Diocese of Oklahoma, there's 70 congregations. The average Sunday attendance is just under 5,000 people. So if you take Tulsa and Oklahoma City out of the mix, you're left with lots of very small churches in very small communities. How do they get served? And the bishop says, yes, I got it. It's bivocational ministry, which is something that is growing, especially in the center of the United States of America.
And so those 5 characteristics are defined in the diocesan canon?
They're not in the canons. Like I said, I think it's a discipline imposed by the bishop working with the commission and the standing committee. It's not canonical, and it's one of the things that I spoke to the bishop about, and he's kind of considering it. And of course, now with the new bishop coming on board, the considerable grows wider, you know. But should a candidate for ordination who seeks bivocational ministry sign an accord with the bishop that these 5 things are agreed to by the priest and the bishop? I mean, should it be that specific? And I'm the kind of guy who says, well, yeah, I think it ought to be that specific. So anyway, there you go. Yeah. And then reception of clergy from other churches. Notice it doesn't say other denominations, right? It's clergy from other churches. And this regulates, so if you are, say, a Presbyterian minister, and you seek to become a priest in the Episcopal Church, that would be section 4 of this canon, right? That would be clergy ordained in churches not in the historic succession. And you notice at our diocesan convention, we changed the word from the old wording that was in the old canons of the apostolic succession to the words that, as they're currently in our church now, the historic succession. So that presbyter in the Presbyterian Church was probably not ordained by churches in the historic succession. And I'll go up from the bottom. Clergy ordained by bishops and churches in the historic succession, but not in full communion with this church. Who would that be? Who would be? Yeah, the Roman Catholic Church, right? That priest is obviously ordained by a bishop in the historic succession, but they're not in communion with us, right? How about clergy ordained by bishops in communion with this church? Yeah, and some canon lawyers will tell you that also pertains to the Church of England, the Anglican Church of Canada, Church in Mexico, that they're ordained by bishops in communion with this church, but there needs to be a process by which that person is received into this branch of the church. And the chancellor, the presiding bishop, has gone so far on this particular provision to say that those priests must renounce their ministry before coming on board as a part of the Episcopal Church. Now, that sounds pretty drastic to me, but he's a smart guy, so. Any questions? Okay, so it's about 1:45. Why don't we take a 7-minute break, and we'll then get into the disciplinary canons. But first, I just want to ask if you have any questions or comments to make before we move into Title IV. Oh, I should have told about the other canon, shouldn't I? I should have done that. But anyway, notice I went through 11 through 15 in one line. It pertains mostly to bishops. And then if there was ever a canon that I would advise the church to simply get rid of, it would be Title III, Canon 16, that regulates the board for transition ministry. That should just be an office that reports directly to the presiding bishop. Any other questions? Okay, we'll take a little break and then we'll get into the disciplinary canons. I've been in court for arbitration, mediation, and negotiation regarding lawsuits that have been placed against bishops and members of the priesthood. And so it's important because when we neglect or forget the covenants and promises that we have made to one another, the whole church is injured as a result of that. So, okay, a little background. Title IV details the grounds and processes for ecclesiastical discipline. It's a church-wide structure, so it doesn't matter if you're a bishop, a priest, or deacon, or bivocational. This applies to you. Unlike the canons were changed, maybe about 10 years ago, and as I'm told, the canons as they were structured before this most recent change were somewhat reflective of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Title IV is amended to more echo the peer review process that you might see amongst lawyers or amongst members of the medical profession. It seeks to encourage accountability, justice, reconciliation, restoration, and pastoral responses. So it goes into much detail. You really should read it, even if it's the kind of reading that you wouldn't normally do. Again, you're agreeing to abide by this. You don't want to discover that something happened after you're ordained and you didn't know anything about it. So Title IV all members of the clergy are accountable. And you may not knowingly violate the Constitution and canons of the Church. You may not bring false accusations under Title IV to another member of the clergy. You may not misrepresent any material related to the admission of postulancy, candidacy, or ordination. So if a priest knowingly falsifies a document that moves you forward in the ordination process, that priest has committed an offense under Title IV. And the use of retaliation, to use the disciplinary canons to retaliate, is forbidden. So there are then, under Title IV, standards of clergy conduct that need to be known to respect and to preserve confidence. Here's one, conforming to the rubrics of the prayer book. So you know, the rubrics have canonical force. Abiding by the ordination vows. There's something called a pastoral direction that is kind of put into the beginning process of the disciplinary canons. They're really, in effect, separate from it. It's if in the bishop's opinion that he or she needs to give a pastoral direction to a member of the clergy, they may do so without fully engaging the Title IV process. But for a cleric to ignore a pastoral direction by a bishop is in and of itself an offense under Title IV. So good to know. Safeguarding the property of the church, reporting to the intake officer a constitution concerning an offense, that is to say that you have an affirmative responsibility to bring something that you think might be an offense to the intake officer of the diocese, and then exercising ministry in accordance with the canons. So on page 7, we then get into those things that it's a code of conduct, that when we sign that document ascribing to Article 8 of the Constitution at our ordination, these are the things that embody that code of conduct. So we refrain from sexual misconduct. We refrain from holding any teaching or doctrine contrary to that held by the Church. This is one that the bivocational priests really need to be aware of. You must refrain from engaging in secular employment without the consent of the bishop. That applies to deacons, it applies to priests, it applies to bivocational clergy of any. It used to be that you were required to inform the bishop if you had intended to marry to get the bishop's permission. That's no longer in the canons anymore. Being absent from the diocese for more than 2 years without the consent of the bishop. And so it does happen that someone will be ordained a priest or deacon, and then they'll move, to Alaska or something, and that they'll just kind of forget. Things will kind of trail off. And the value here is the bishop can't be your bishop if the bishop doesn't know what you're doing. So if you find yourself to be away for some reason, it's good to write to the bishop once a year just to let the bishop know what you're up to. Because being absent from the diocese for more than 2 years without the consent of the bishop is an infraction of the standards of clergy conduct. So this year, on January the 3rd, I wrote a letter to my bishop, Dabney Smith, saying, having a blast here in Oklahoma. Wishing you were here. No, I did. I said, we're having a great time. We're glad we did this. But I'm under an obligation to inform my bishop what I'm up to. And in our diocesan canons in Southwest Florida, that I'm required to do that by March 1st of every year, covering the year that was preceding. So it's especially important for clergy who are retired. So being a retired member of the clergy does not release you from this. So even if you're not working, you still have an obligation. That is to say, if you want to be considered to be a member of the clergy, you've got to do that. If you don't, then there's a provision in the disciplinary canons called the abandonment of the ministry. So if it comes to a scenario where the bishop can no longer warrant that he has the capability of being your bishop because of information that you did not give the bishop, you can be deposed for reasons that do not affect your moral character. You can't just disappear into the sunset. Criminal acts, dishonesty, fraud, deceit, misrepresentation, habitual neglect of the exercise of the office, or this is a big, broad one. What is conduct unbecoming a member of the clergy? It's pretty wide, isn't it? We have erred and strayed from thy commandments. We have not followed the devices and desires of our own hearts. So anyway, Title IV is long, it is detailed, and what I'd like to do is share with you, there is a website dedicated to all aspects of Title IV, and it's called Title IV, titleiv.org. And everything, you know, the court of review, the hearing panel, you know, what is an advocate, what is an advisor, who is the church attorney, what is a respondent, what is a complainant, you know, all of those titles that come under the description of the canon are there for you to take a look at. And there's a specific section under this website called titleiv.org that pertains to postulants and candidates in the ordination process. So I thought I'd share some of that with you. The first one comes from the Canons of the Ordinary in Montana, talking about why it's important for us to do this. And I won't go through every one, but the first one is that. The last one is a message from Gay Jennings, who is the president of the House of Bishops. Okay? So, yeah.
Just out of curiosity, the notification of secular employment, is that something that might be withheld and he might say, you can't do that? Or, I mean, what is the thought behind that?
I think that the thought behind that is for the bishop to be able to be your pastor. So if you've been, say, fired and you get new employment, you've got to, you know, you're under an obligation. If you're secularly employed when you're ordained, that's one thing. But if you gain another form of secular employment afterward, you've got an obligation to notify the bishop of that. And I think the intent behind it is essentially pastoral, to make sure that the, you know...
It's not intended to withhold.
It's not intended to be punitive, I believe. I think it's intended to be pastoral.
And I was wondering, does a resignation stop a disciplinary proceeding, or is this like a secular court, civil and criminal, it's to go forward with or without you?
If you decide to resign your orders when you're in the middle of a disciplinary, that would be rejected. You can't. You're not permitted to. Yeah. Right.
And like criminal offenses, is there a requirement that the church report it to civil authorities, secular authorities?
Certainly anything that involves sexual misconduct, the church would be considered a mandatory reporter. Now, what if you conduct prayers on the steps of the South African embassy and are arrested for disturbing the peace? Well, you know, that could be a crime. That could be a misdemeanor. And sometimes, just because there are laws in a government doesn't mean that those laws are necessarily moral. Right, so just as a rector has protections under Title III, Canon 9, that you can't fire a rector, you have to go through a dissolution of the pastoral relationship. Why? It's because, for example, in 1931, the Bishop of Florida called the Ku Klux Klan an anti-Christian organization, and he said that the city of St. Petersburg has no right to forbid people from going to the movies on Sunday. There was a lot of people who were screaming at him on account of that, but he thought it was the right thing to do. So to protect the minister's availability to be a prophetic witness, there are certain protections that are placed in. So criminal conduct does involve some, you know, that would be taken care of probably at the intake phase.
Are disciplinary proceedings published?
Some are, some aren't. I'll get into that in a bit. Okay, well, let's take a look. Yeah.
I got questions. Got two questions about
Yeah.
it. One of them is, if one of the priests make an invitation to the congregation to practice the confession of the sins,
Yeah.
but not in, in a personal way, and then somebody trusting on the priest with a criminal issue, he just talk about it, and then in this case, the priest is in obligation to let not.
Well, there's an exception for confession in Title IV. Also, in the rite of the reconciliation of a penitent, a priest giving absolution is considered to be morally absolute, which is to say that you must not convey those details to the authorities.
I think he was asking if it's done, but outside a official confession. Is that right? Not a part of a confession to a priest, or just kind of done more generally?
No, I'm talking about when somebody decides to make a confession, but with the priest.
Yeah.
You say, I need to confess, and then he says something about.
He says, "I shot John."
I killed somebody.
Right.
Or
Mm-hmm.
this kind of issue. So the priest is in obligation to go to the, authority to.
What I would say is that if that is done in the form of a confession, the priest has options. One is to say, I will not grant absolution for this. Now, at that point, it's really incumbent on the offender to go to the authorities, but the priest would be free, him or herself, to go to the authorities because they haven't given absolution. They haven't released that person from that confession yet. But once absolution is granted for that, that is morally absolute. You must not convey that, even if you know that the person committed a crime.
Okay. And by the other hand, my second question is, talking about one of the bishops on one of the North states, in the United States, he was disagree about the gay marriage, and he said that, well, when my arguments are coming from the Bible for this point, and then, Bishop Michael Corey started to talk with this guy, and at this point, the priests under that bishop they are in obligation to follow the instructions of that bishop, or can say both? Wrong you are, I can follow you.
Right. The thing that preceded marriage equality in the Episcopal Church was a document called "I will bless you and you will be a blessing," and that set forth a lot of the discussion points leading up to allowing same-sex marriages within the Episcopal Church. You'll find within that document that if a singular priest, in their interpretation of page 422 of the Book of Common Prayer, says that marriage is a lifelong union between a man and a woman, and that individual priest morally cannot bring him or herself to do the wedding, they may not be forced to do the wedding, but the wedding would still be valid, canonical, admissible, and equal if somebody else did it. So, make sense? Yeah? Okay. So, important, I think, the first one being important, and as much as it kind of stresses that as a member of the clergy, you will more than likely be dealing with vulnerable people, which can get you yourself into areas that might not be easy to judge, and you need to be careful about that. And then Gay Jennings underscoring the fact that self-care for clergy is important for all kinds of reasons. And so the obtaining of a spiritual director or a peer group, one of the things we hope addresses this within the diocese is the Fresh Start program for new clergy. So after you're ordained, you join this Fresh Start group, and that forms a kind of a group of some accountability. So let me, a couple things I want to pass out to you. One has to do with, it's known as the basic shape of Title IV. So let me just take this and just take one and pass it around. And I feel a permission and a license to steal from any diocese in the Episcopal Church. This is stolen without the permission of the Diocese of Southern Virginia, but it's good. So you could call this a flow chart, right? So, and you notice it all begins in the upper left-hand corner where someone has made a complaint. It all begins with a complaint. The complaint then goes to a person called the intake officer. I've got a couple of recommendations as I prepare for my return to Florida. One will be is that the intake officer of the diocese should not be a member of the bishop's staff. The second is that there should be more than one intake officer. There should be at least one male and one female intake officer, simply to facilitate conversation. So this complaint goes to the intake officer, and it's the duty of the intake officer at that time to decide that these allegations would constitute an offense if they were true. The intake officer is not tasked with determining whether or not they're true. So they could be totally made up, but if they were true, would they constitute an offense? And that is then sent to, if not, the intake officer can simply dismiss it. Now, if it's dismissed, there is a process of appeal. So if the person making the complaint hears from the intake officer that's being dismissed, that person can then make an appeal, and that appeal goes directly to the president of the disciplinary board of the diocese. So, a person issuing a complaint has a right to appeal. So if either the intake officer has decided to move it to the next step, then if it's yes, it goes to a group called the reference panel. The reference panel in this diocese is the intake officer, the bishop, and the president of the disciplinary board. This is designed to be not a court. It's not a hearing panel. It is simply people who have the responsibility of making this a little more formal. So one of the things the reference panel can do is say, Bishop, you need to make a pastoral response to this, but beyond that, we don't think anything's happened. Terms of discipline can be arrived at in agreement with the bishop. It can be sent to something called conciliation, or it needs to go further. The reference panel says, we agree with the intake officer, we need to move this down the road a little bit. It then goes to a slightly more formal group called a conference panel. And that's Canon 12, page 223 in the book. And the conference panel has no witnesses. We're talking about the impeachment of the President of the United States right now, and part of what they're talking about is how they substructure that process, right? In this process, that has already been given. There are no witnesses, there's no record, and no statements that may be issued into evidence. The idea of the conference panel is to confer. They may dismiss, they may send a conciliation, they may issue an order, or they may have the person making the complaint, who's called the complainant, and the person against whom the complaint is made, that person is called the respondent. The conference panel may ask them to enter into an accord. Now, once you get past that, and it's referred to the hearing panel, that's quite formal. Any attorney who's been a part of a trial will know all the bits and pieces of the hearing panel. There are evidentiary rules, there's statements that can be made, that a record of that particular group is put forward, and it's moving us toward this idea of some kind of an accord being made. That accord could be any one of a number of responses. The priest could be completely deposed and deprived of their right to practice ministry. They could be temporarily inhibited. They could insist on restitution if it was a financial matter. There's all kinds of things that could be happening at that time. And then even when you get to the end of the diocesan process, there is yet one more recourse, and that is to go to a provincial court of review. I think that's only ever happened 3 times in the past 25 years in the history of the Episcopal Church, that something's gone to the provincial level. And even then, one of the things that could happen is that the whole thing could switch back to the hearing panel one more time. And so that is, it kind of gives you a very, very general workflow. It's important, you know, as something like this happens, have something like this in front of you, just so that you know how the traffic flows, you know. That's covered in the canons. That would be, the conference panel would be on page 223, and Canon 13 would tell you about the makeup of those. There is a church attorney who is not the chancellor of the diocese. That is an attorney who, in a sense, the chancellor is an advisor to the bishop. The church attorney represents the church or the diocese itself in this matter. So does that make sense? Yeah? I thought an important thing for you to have in front of you. Yeah?
So, important to what Robbie says earlier, how much of this is discoverable? If one of Robbie's colleagues at a newspaper gets wind that there's something going on and says, hey, we'd like to have copies of these records, is any of this protected? Or is it discoverable? I
think that is covered in, it would be discoverable after the hearing panel phase, under Canon 13.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Then lastly, I have one last thing to give you all. And it's just a little piece. I don't know if you love or hate Wikipedia. But I pulled a little piece called...
I love it. I'm a huge fan of it.
Okay. Canon Law of the Episcopal Church in the United States of America. Just take one of these and pass it to the center. And while that's, I'll just kind of go over it as it's being passed out. It's not essential, but I just thought it gave another bit of detail. Unlike the system of canon law in the Church of England, which constitutes to be drawn from the canon law of the Western Church, English ecclesiastical law did not remain in force in the Episcopal Church after the American Revolution. Well, of course it didn't, right? So there are 2 parallel systems of canon law within the Church, operating on a national level governed by the General Convention, and on a diocesan level, which each diocesan convention empowered to create the Constitution and canons. Diocesan constitutions do not require the approval of the General Convention. And here's the point. The Episcopal Church is notable among Anglican churches for the extent to which the Constitution and canons of the General Convention leave matters to regulation at diocesan and parochial levels. It's one of the reasons that when it comes to, you know, the 2003 approval of the Canon of the Ordinary, the Diocese of New Hampshire to be its next bishop, Gene Robinson, or the issue of same-sex marriage. Mostly that will tend to happen in the States because we leave so much of this to the local level. This would take much longer to reach a Canadian ecclesiastical court system or an English system. And of course, with the Church of England being the established church of the English people, that it would simply it'd be a more cumbersome legal process for that to happen. Here, the Diocese of New Hampshire can elect anybody they want to be their next bishop, right? And then it's a matter. It's not a. It's a pattern of approval then. Most of the standing committees, as we have to do with the bishop-elect of this diocese, you need a majority of all the standing committees to approve, but it can't be forbidden at the beginning. Does that make sense? It can be approved of, but it cannot be outlawed from the get-go. Okay? Okay, well, I downloaded a lot of material for you, and I gave you a heavy book that I'm asking you to read at your leisure. There will be no test, but one of the things that... Oh, that's right. We reserve the right to test this. And what I'll do is when I get back, there really should be a certificate in your file that says that you've done this, because it's a separate requirement. Like I said, there's formation, there's education, and there's training. As this is a training requirement, I think it needs to be separately certified. So I'll send you a copy of that, and I'll put another one in your file. Okay? All right?